Hello there, my name's Richard Jones, and I'm joined today by a guest who's got a new suspect in the hunt for Jack the Ripper. The guest is Jonathan Tye, and the suspect is a man called Edward Buckley. So, hello, Jonathan.
Hi, how you doing? All right.
Not bad at all. So, Edward Buckley, a new suspect that we've got. So, obvious question, who was Edward Buckley?
So Edward was, I suppose, an Irish Cockney. He was very much from and part of the Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and St George's area. He was born 1854 in the July. Um, Down by Tobacco Dock, the family were a migrant Irish family. So his father, Daniel Buckley, was from Cork, and they'd settled in the area, as you would expect, around Tobacco Dock, where the sort of the migrant gateway. The father was a cigar maker, and then gradually, as the family grew, they moved up towards more towards the commercial road. And by the 1880s, they're established in Morgan Street, which I believe become Hessel Street. So this great melting pot street, not far from Burner Street. By 1880, there's two brothers that Edward has: a Thomas, who's the younger brother, born in 1862, and John, 1859. They're quite central to his story, and he has a sister as well called Mary, and another sister a little bit older that we kind of lose track of, Elizabeth. But the brothers are all seem to be active. I suppose you call them at that stage in the 1870s, 80s, petty criminals. Edward's certainly already got form for pickpocketing. He's seen in 1874 on the Chelsea Embankment. I think the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh was opening the new embankment, and he's pickpocketing there with another sort of young Irish Cockney lad. He sees a policeman, and I think he calls out "slop," which means drop it. So he's been caught there. So he served some time as well, short time by the 1880s. And his brother John is definitely operating off the commercial road, mugging and terrorising people, to use a sort of modern word. John is particularly violent. In one case, towards a gentleman's wife. They rob a couple called the Cocklings, and John turns his attention mainly to the wife. He uses obscene language to her and strikes her down in this robbery, and that's sort of in 1879. So that's the kind of background to the family. Sort of, they're part of the Irish community, which I think dominated the area at the time, and they're very familiar with the sort of the commercial road area.
And how did you first come across him?
So, from my point of view, I consider myself a historian, and I was becoming quite attracted to the Ripper story. But the Ripper experts are already out there. There's people like yourself and plenty of other writers have sort of done and dusted the Ripper story. My curiosity is what came before. What was the genesis of the Ripper? What was the background? What was the circumstances that created him? So I decided to really concentrate my efforts on researching the period before 1888. I tried to avoid the year 1888 completely. So I would search using the newspaper archives, the genealogical sites, sort of from the mid 1870s to 1887, looking for clues. I'd use words such as rip. Where does that term originate from? Or stab, abdomen, unfortunate attack. And it was and I also looked at individual streets in the area based on the Booth maps. There's some notorious streets, Devonshire Street being one of them. So it was during one of these sort of searches that I come across one of the attacks that Edward made. I cross-reference, as I learned to do, with the other sort of sites, the casebook sites, the JTR forums, and I think even one of your the website that you have, just to see if anyone's looked at him. And I was quite astonished to find that only one researcher, Chris Scott, back in 2004, had made a reference to one of the articles. And interestingly, he said, this might not be the Ripper, but this might be the sort of attack the Ripper may have made starting out. And then there was nothing else. There was no follow-up. He wasn't recording anywhere else. And I was presented with a blank canvas. I suppose I was so pleased I had something to work with, and then I've built the case from there. And kept sort of stayed on it for the last couple of years, and then recently, about 5 months ago, I found out independently that Jurriaan Masseen was also searching Edward, and we've collaborated, and it's been fantastic working with him, and we've accelerated the knowledge we have and built a picture of his whole life. He's so richly sourced as an individual in the newspapers. And the records we have. So we've been able to plot this gentleman's life, or this man's life, from more or less cradle to grave.
Because that's a really interesting point about the fact that you look before 1888 and you try to leave out the year 1888. Because I think one of the problems that we have today is people tend to have a tunnel vision about the period of the murders, and that's what they look at. Whereas, of course, the whole thing plays out against a backcloth, a canvas of history. And it's not just 1888. I've always felt that there must have been other attacks, other murders possibly, before the Jack the Ripper murders themselves started. And so I always think it's massively important to look into that period beforehand and afterwards as well, and just see, are there any things that bear similarity? So that's a really interesting way to do it. And I think to completely not look at 1888 is a really good thing. One thing I often get, a comment I often get, if I put up something about a knife attack in Whitechapel or somebody stabbing someone in 1884 or 1883, I often get the comment, what's this got to do with Jack the Ripper? It's the wrong year. And you think, well, it's got a lot to do with Jack the Ripper. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens across a whole period of time. And I think that's so important. But coming back to Buckley, though, so he had a love of his life as well, didn't he? And that was a lady called Frances Jones, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
But when I say love of the life, he was very, very violent I mean, that poor woman suffered an awful lot at the hands of Edward Buckley, didn't she?
Yeah, I think that Edward Buckley's story, the heart of it, is this relationship he has with Frances Jones. It's how we analyse it. Is he an obsessed, sort of bullying husband that is fully in love with, or is it a manipulative relationship? Is it like I always would compare it to the sort of Michael Kidney, Liz Stride relationship? Has he got her under lock and key? She's a source of earnings, but it's at the heart of the story. The beginning, the middle, the end of this story is about the violence he inflicts upon this unfortunate woman, and her, I suppose, to 1888 at least, her inability to free herself of him. It's in many ways it's a real tragic story for Frances and what she went through. Whether or not in Edward's head or his heart he was in love with her, it's a strange kind of love, because it's a very manipulative, domineering, obsessive kind of relationship.
And she was what was termed at the time an unfortunate, so one of the lower class of the prostitutes. That's what her, for want of a better word, her occupation is given out in various newspaper records. So did he meet her when she was an unfortunate, or did he meet her before and turn her into an unfortunate?
That's a really good question. She's referred to as an unfortunate as an unfortunate for the first time, believe it or not, in a newspaper report in May 1888. Prior to that, the press cover their relationship. It's more like they're two. A lover's tiff is too soft a word, but the relationship is sort of presented as if they are a couple that are having violent difficulties or difficulties. In terms of where they come across each other, she is living in 1881. She's living in 235 Whitechapel Road, which was a coffee house run by a gentleman called Thomas Wharton. She's boarding there with another lady called Alice Watkins. They're both roughly the same age, and their profession is recorded as NK, not known. My thoughts are that they were already prostitutes at that time. Whether or not they were operating in the area with a pimp or a bully, or whether that coffee shop was a cover for a brothel. I'm not entirely sure. But that's where the relationship intertwines with Edward. That's where that must have occurred, and there's a number of instances that we can talk about that will prove that. Interestingly, as well, and I cover it in the article that I put in the Adams magazine, Alice Watkins suffered a murder-suicide attempt in Bishopsgate in Brushfield Street, a gentleman by the name of Robinson, and it's reported like he'd become obsessed with this Alice Watkins, and he shoots her through the cheek in an attempt to kill her, and then shoots himself. He dies, but she recovers, and I think she's left scarred by the attack. Both those women went through a similar kind of horror. I picture two very attractive women operating in some kind of a small brothel. That's what I picture, but I can't prove it. But that's where I believe she came across Edward, and they've then sort of had a relationship from there.
Do you know when they first met, when the two of them became an item, as it were?
There is evidence. We know that in September 1882, she gives birth to a child in Stepney Workhouse. So she's listed as being single and unmarried, and she gives birth to a child. We don't know the fate of that child, but by her history, I suspect that it's a stillborn or she loses a child. In April of 1884, the same thing happens again. She loses a child, and then for the first time, we can see the relationship with Edward. So, in June of 1884, Edward tries to enter the coffee shop at 2 a.m. in the morning. He's banging on the door and requesting entry, when the proprietor, that I assume to be Thomas, refuses his entry. He chucks his hat at him, and a policeman, John Mann, intercedes, and then Edward attacks that policeman. So that's the first instance we've got where we can see that there is a connection between the two. She's resident in that place. I think they probably, well, we know subsequently that they both used the pub, which was just along the road at 235, which is the East London Tavern, which was built around an old theatre run by a Jewish landlord called Jonas Wolff. So those two places along the Whitechapel Road are very key to the story. This is where all the early events take place. So we have this initial indication that something's not right in June, where he tries to get into this coffee establishment.
So we know by this time he is a very violent man. And violence almost comes naturally to him. If he's in a situation, if he gets angry, if he gets raged, then he's going to attack. So he hits out at the policeman, he hits out at her, he hits out at the coffee shop owner as well. She's broken away from him in 1884, hasn't she? And she's gone back. Is it back to her father in Southwark?
Well, there's a lead up to that. So we've just talked about this coffee shop incident where he's tried to get in, and then the next time we see her is that in August, not in the East End of London, but over at Sparrocks Road, which is a very quiet thoroughfare. It's now gone, blitzed, obviously lost in the Blitz, which had hop houses and warehouses just behind the Guy's Hospital. If you look at a photograph, actually, it's almost like a strange inverted image of Bucks Row. It's like looking at it from the other way around, with the sort of large building, with the bald squat at the end is the hospital, if that makes sense. So in August, a policeman's on patrol, and he hears the cry or shriek of murder, and he goes down to Sparrocks Row, and he finds a gentleman who's obviously Edward standing above Francis, who's prostrate on the ground. He's holding a pocket knife, and then he just flees. She's been stabbed in the abdomen, and it's strong enough to have gone through her ulster or through her dress, through her petticoats, and I think sort of into an inch into an abdomen, which I think an abdominal knife attack is quite unusual in itself. So he's tried to stab her there. The policeman obviously caught up with him great difficulty. And whenever Edward is referred to in the press, he's always tackled with great difficulty. Sometimes it takes more than one policeman. He threatens to knife the policeman too. If you don't let me go, I will knife you too, are the words he uses. But he gets taken back to Stonehenge police station. Frances has followed along. She's very in a weakened state. She's got a head wound as well, which suggests he probably struck her to knock her to the ground. But what happens thereafter is that Frances kind of disappears, and you alluded at the beginning about her moving over the water. So the press explained that the background to this is that they'd been living together in Tarling Street, which is to the southern end of St George's. They'd broken up because of his treatment towards her, and she had moved back to her people just off Long Lane in South London. And we've been able to trace that because her family were an East End family for most of the censuses, but I think her mother dies in sometime in the 1880s, probably 82, 83, and the father relocates to Long Lane. So she's obviously decided to get out and move back there. But she's then lost. The police can't follow up. Edward is bailed, and the kind of the story ends there for the time being. So it's either fear or I don't know if he's able to charm her back. I always refer to he has like a dark charisma. But yes, so they break up for that time. The case is not able to be followed up because she's disappeared. And that's where we get to for the kind of the Sparrocks Row attack in the August of 1884.
And do you think he, for want of a better way of putting it, do you think he got to her to persuade her not to appear as a witness against him?
Yeah, I think there's instances throughout the whole of his criminal career, whether it's the violence towards her and there's some real great examples in terms of some of the robberies, the thefts that he carries out, that witnesses just do not then follow up. And I think there's evidence that his family network, the brothers John, Buckley, and Thomas, are deeply involved in that. So we can move the story on slightly in terms of to the November of that year. She's definitely back with him. So in the November, she's recorded in the newspapers as Frances Buckley. So it's almost like she's his wife. A policeman is called to Fenton Street, and Edward's standing there, and he's driven a fork into the back. It's an awful attack, so far into the back of Frances that it's gone to the hilt of the fork, and it's broke one of the prongs bent one of the prongs. Edward drops the fork, and a policeman, his name was Henry Green, just concentrates on dealing with Edward, and Frances is sort of ushered away and kept from the policeman. So Edward's arrested and taken back, and they say to him, well, you need to go back and speak to the victim here. He goes back and she's gone. And the person that's central to that and stopping the justice is John Buckley, who subsequently then assaults one of the clerks of the court who tries to deal with this case. So yes, there's a real element of control and fear, but she'd gone back to him. She'd gone back to him somehow, and they were again together. They're recorded together again.
So that they're, I mean, we've got a basically almost like a Cray family of the 19th century. We've got.
I think that's a great one. Yeah, I've started to refer to them as like almost like a Cray setup. You could picture them being an early sort of set of Crays. Yeah.
Yeah, and do we know if they were well known in the area? I mean, obviously he was known to the police, but were they known as sort of a gangland family?
We've read the press so extensively for these guys, and we've looked up every reference we can, but they don't seem to stand out. There's not like unless they've got a name that we can't connect to Buckley, there's no real names that stand out. There's no other references to the Buckley gang or that I've been able to find, but I do think that they are a particularly vicious and dangerous family.
Because there are, I mean, we should point out that the gang problem was a massive problem in Victorian Whitechapel, and obviously on into the 20th century as well, and well into the 20th century. But we know he was we know Edward Buckley was a nasty piece of work. We know he involved in pickpocketing, intimidation, violence, domestic violence. And you've been tracing him through the courts. So can you give us an idea of some of the other crimes besides the domestic assaults that he was hauled up for and for which he was imprisoned?
Yeah, there's some great examples. Just before the incident I've just described to you, the Fork incident in October 1884, a gentleman, a horse dealer from Deal in Kent, James Arnold, takes a great deal of money to a cattle market, to a horse cattle market in Islington. When he's there, he notices that there are three gentlemen, and he says they're respectable looking. One of them is Edward. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the other two gentlemen, and they're kind of around him, and he's suspicious. He checks his pockets, and his money's gone, and it's vanished. So he's been very wary of Edward, who's been standing next to him, and Edward, the way he's holding his hand, he thinks his money's been taken by them. So it goes to court. They're called in, but the next day, at the court, and this is to laughter of the court itself, and a real sort of cynicism from the judge. He says, "I've been home. It's all been a mistake. I found my money under my pillow," and I think that's an early indication of the intimidation that this family is able to place. Whether that was John Buckley or Thomas or another member of the gang going and saying, "You don't follow this through, because there'll be consequences," because he just completely changes his mind. And as I say, the court laughs at him, and the judge says this is a strange state of affairs. So that's one example. The family are connected to racing offences. I think to horse racing courses. I think that's where they like crowds, and that's where they pickpocket. And there's a great example of one of these activities in April 1889. April 1887. Apologies. He's at Kempton races, and he's in the betting ring. The victim, an Alfred Ben, a Camberwell butcher. I think he's got £60 on him. Again, they seem to carry quite a lot of money around for the race day, and he notices that Edward's sort of sidled up to him, and he feels his hand go in his pocket, and he loses his money. He tries to grab his left hand, but Edward he's managed to keep it out of the way, so he grabs his right hand and holds on for dear life. And before he knows it, he's assaulted. He's kicked to the ground. He's beaten. But he still holds on, and the policeman arrests Edward, and Edward's taken back to the police station. But Edward strangely says, the first thing he says is, "Did you not catch the other 2 or 3 men before me?" And what I think he's referring to is his money safe. His money's been taken by his confederates, and that's all he's interested in. And while he was being led from that ring, the crowds were shouting, "Release him, shame, Rouse." The person likely to have led those shouts is his brother John, because John was also a pickpocket with connection to the racecourses. He's arrested in 1889 at Kempton Park at the train station, and he attempts, and he uses the train pulling up to get in front of a gentleman called Henry Fall James, who's trying to board the train and to steal his money. He actually he doesn't get convicted of that particular assault, but there is form there. And interestingly, on the 1891 census, and I don't know if it's ironic humour, John Buckley gives the profession of turf accountant. So they've got this kind of strange connection but this connection to the racecourses. And I think they're going out on these major festivals where there are large crowds, and they're working those crowds. Edward loved a crowd. That's what he drove him, I think, and he was able to pickpocket. We know that in 1899 at Epsom he was arrested as well. So that's central to his criminal career. This racecourse connection. One of the things I've said, and this is moving on, is that we talk often about the Ripper in October 1888, Where was Jack the Ripper? Did he have a hand injury? Was it the roadworks going on in the streets? What kept him off the streets? Well, I would propose that this race connection, could he have been in October on the road at a large race event? And that's why he wasn't around. And what better reason to return to London and to Whitechapel would be that Lord Mayor's Fair, which would also be ripe for pickpockets. So there's that element as well. But that's just something to throw out there.
And that, of course, the Lord Mayor's procession was the day of Mary Kelly's murder.
Exactly, yeah.
So you mentioned when you were talking about the racetrack, you mentioned his left hand. Didn't he have an injury to his left hand?
Yes, and this is it's a great signature that we can use to track him, because one of the formulation events of his personality, I believe, or we believe, was a fight that occurred in Fashion Street back in 1882. It demonstrates perfectly what the family are like. Thomas, the younger brother, the Old Bailey sort of tells the story. He says he was sent to fetch his father from a pub in Fashion Street, which I'm assuming might be the Queen's Head. It could have been that pub on the corner. When he got there, he finds his father, obviously Daniel, with his jacket off, very worse for wear for, he says, liquor. And Edward is fighting another gentleman called John Donovan, a 21-year-old. And he cannot drag his brother. He just cannot drag his brother away. He tries. The police even intervene. And then for some reason, the fight is able to continue. So I don't know if the police stopped it and then went away and then it gets carried on. But at some point, Edward is stabbed. He's stabbed twice in the abdomen and once in the hand, in his left hand, and it causes the arteries to spurt. He's treated at the Commercial Street Free Hospital by a surgeon called Abraham Cohen, who says one of those stab wounds in the abdomen was in a very serious place. I think he was there for 17, 18 or 18 days, and he damaged his arteries in his left hand. So whether or not that caused him to need to learn how to use the other hand on occasion, when he's arrested at Kempton, the policeman says, I've looked at his hand, there don't seem that much wrong with it, but he definitely uses that as an excuse that this left hand has suffered some kind of damage. But that's where it originated. It originated all the way back in Fashion Street. And the Fashion Street incident, the person that was prosecuted, John Donovan, was found innocent. And his last words were, it was not me that started this attack. I was chased through the streets by Edward Buckley with a knife and Thomas Buckley with an iron bar. So these are very aggressive. And we know at the time, John Buckley was probably in Flower and Dean Street in a lodging house. So there's a connection to that area.
So we've got them in the area. I mean, one of the problems with any suspect, with so many suspects, is you can't actually put them in the area at the time. I mean, the list, you could just go through the list of almost every suspect, and in almost every case, with a very few exceptions, you can't put them in the area at the time. But we can certainly put Edward Buckley in the area at the time, albeit he'd just come out of prison, hadn't he, in February 1888. He'd just been released from prison, and he'd come back into the area.
Yeah, so he's geographically there's some major connections. So when the major attack he commits against Francis occurs in October the 2nd, 1885, and this is what he goes away for 12 months for this particular crime. When that crime takes place, he's lodging at 14 Hanbury Street. That's his lodging address. He's in the top room. So there's a couple of incidents in the lead up, which I spoke at the beginning about this key area, that the 235 address at Whitechapel Road, which is the East London Tavern, and 239. We know that in September he walks into the East London Tavern where Francis is drinking, and he strikes her. He literally assaults her, and John or Jonas Wolfe says that she's treated appallingly. She's kicked by Edward while she's on the ground. The press coverage is appalling. It says, the headlines of the East London Observer is, it almost served her right, because Edward claims that she'd stolen money from him. He goes away for 4 weeks for that, but he's already lodging at 14 Hambridge Street. When he comes out 4 weeks later, he goes straight to Devonshire Street and commits this horrific attack where the knife is drawn down her face, the room is blooded, and she's found sort of in a supplicating manner on the bed in this blooded room. And this is where he does 12 months for it in Coldbath Fields. But sorry, going back to the address, at that time he's found in 14 Hanbury Street by the police the following day, and he says this flippant term, this is a lot of hassle for a brass now. This is a lot of hassle for a prostitute that's basically taken my money. But from that 14 Hanbury Street address, you can see number 29. The building today, I've only recently found out, is a replacement building, but it had a similar height. It's next door to where Bud Flanagan was born, so you can see it if you go up there. But he was in the top room. He would have known what that yard or that side entrance for 29 would have been used for. And if he's a regular user of unfortunates or prostitutes, he may have already been down there at some point, even as early as 1885. But you could clearly see that he would have been very familiar with that location. So that's one of the addresses. Obviously, we've got the earlier family addresses, which is in Morgan Street, not far from Berners Street. When he comes out of prison for the attack on Francis, the major attack, we know that he's in Sydney Street, 106 Sydney Street, which is just north of the famous building from the siege. So it's at the top, more or less at the top end towards Raven Row. So that's where he's lodging when he comes out, but he's not out for very long because of the Kempton affair. But he assaults a barman in the Three Compasses pub, which is in Raven Row. So that's going around the back of the hospital. And that area itself is quite, it's connected to Jack's Hole down to the south and Devonshire Street. It's an area where unfortunates we know that unfortunates were often seen outside and a nuisance outside the hospital, and on that corner, which is opposite now what is the Blind Beggar Pub. I think Blind Beggar Pub was 1894, wasn't it, when it actually was established? But that was an area of intimidation for people. He's right at the core of that area, and his brother is lodging in 1891, it was one of my kind of like moments. He's lodging in the Star and Garter pub, which is on the corner of Court Street, one of the possible escape routes for the Ripper for the Nichols murder. He's right in that area. The question has to be, when did he become a lodger there? Because that pub suffered a great deal in a loss of trade during 1888. So I don't know if he moved in after, or was he already established there?
Because that's an interesting point, actually, because I was reading some accounts from the 1889 newspapers about several landlords of pubs in the East End who'd gone bankrupt, and they blamed the Ripper murders for their bankruptcy.
It happened in the Star and Garter, exactly. He went bankrupt because of the Ripper murder. He said his pub was empty.
Yeah, but that again, you mentioned a really interesting area, because it's an area not a lot of people associate or think about or know about. The area around Devonshire Street, Oxford Street, what's now, I think it was Nelson Street, but it is Nelson Street now. And that notorious little, very small area, St. John's Place or John's Place, which was known as Jack's Hole. And it was known as Jack's Hole long before the Jack the Ripper murders.
Yeah, it was one of my kind of little micro studies, Jack's Hole. It absolutely fascinates me because it's a notorious area of. I think there's an unfortunate. I just can't remember her name at the moment that was caught walking down that street, threatening to rip up people, and used that term "rip you." I will rip you up. Before 1888, it was full of brothels and crime, and it was. And again, this is not far from where Edward's operating. I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the characters that dominated that area, because I think in one of the newspaper reports, when they go in to clear the brothels, they talk of this short, stocky, dangerous man. Edward is I think he's between 5'4.5" and 5'6", and he's certainly a sort of short, medium build, stocky fellow. So it makes me wonder if that's who they're referring to.
Do we know what he looked like at the time? And I know we've got this photograph of him, which I think is a later photograph of when he's a police photograph of him when he's been arrested for something. So, but that's later, isn't it? That's about 1900. That photograph.
Yeah. Again, we've got no. That's the only photographic record we've got. I've had an artist that has done she's done some fantastic drawings for me of the injuries to Francis, and she has done an attempted drawing to de-age him. But it's hard to know his complexion in terms of his hair colouring. We know his eyes are grey. He's grey-eyed. I picture a guy that actually was not bad, quite good looking. He's got quite a good set, firm chin and nose, etc. There's evidence, if you look closely at the picture, on his lip. There's like a drop on his lip on to one side, which we've talked about and explored. We wonder if that could be because he's a chronic alcoholic. Has he had a stroke at some point? Because this picture is taken a lot later. Or Ball's palsy, I believe, can be caused by heavy drinking, because he's got this. But there's certainly some kind of blotchiness around his skin, around his lip, which is quite interesting. Whether or not it was there in 1888 or 1885, I'm not sure. But all we've got is a physical description that we know he's between 5'4.5" and 5'6", and he's got these grey eyes. He's got no tattoos and no sort of visible scars of any kind. He's got quite prominent ears, I think you can see on the photo.
Yeah. So he's in that area around the Sydney Street, around Devonshire Street, that little area around there, and Frederick Charrington in late 1887, early 1888, he's going around closing down the brothels with his famous black book. He's got a list of all the brothels in the area, and he's literally marching in with sometimes with a police escort, but sometimes not. And on several occasions, he gets assaulted by what are referred to as pimps and bullies. Do you think Buckley could have been one of the people who assaulted Frederick Charrington?
I do, providing that it's all about the timings, because he did some time at Edward. He was off the streets for obviously until January, February 1888, and he'd been incarcerated before. But I've read those accounts, like yourself, and there is a few shadowy characters that are mentioned that could well be Edward. He's definitely a sort of a hard man of the area, and I wouldn't be surprised.
And one of the things that's quite interesting about him, or it applies to virtually everybody in the area, especially the thieves and the criminals of the area, is they've all got aliases. So I think one of the problems you say you have is you look at things and you have to look again, and then you realise that that's Edward Buckley in court under an alias.
Yeah, absolutely. We are still discovering references that could be Edward because of the aliases used. He uses Henry Jones, Henry Anderson, John Jones, and they are mentioned in his criminal record. There's a great case which occurs quite close, right on the cusp of the Ripper murders in 1889. He's with his brother in early April on the Whitechapel Road. So we know he uses the name Henry Jones, but his brother, as it's mentioned in the press, is Thomas Buckley. So Thomas Buckley and his brother quotes Henry Jones. Assault 3 policemen in the Whitechapel Road. They hold up, and it says, we know how broad the Whitechapel Road is. They hold up the whole traffic in that road, and it takes three policemen to deal with them. Edward takes a running kick at one of them. I mean, he appears the next day in court without his boot and his sock and his leg in, his foot in plaster or bandages. But this puts him in those very streets where these unfortunate women are walking late at night, and he's out there and he's intimidating and he's violent and he's volatile, and he has no qualms about attacking authority. Most of the victims of his attacks are actually policemen, when you look through his history.
And is there any evidence in any of the crimes that he commits, does he use a knife at all? Apart from obviously in the domestic violence towards Francis, he does, but in the street crimes and street robberies, does he use a knife in any of those?
Um, I think looking at his modus operandi, primarily there's pickpocketing, but there's one particular instance where in 1894 he's in Ernest Street in Stepney, which has a connection remotely to Thomas, his brother, and he drinks with this chap down there with another guy. He's with a guy called. He always seems to have younger companions, and this one is William Hudson, and they drink with this guy, put him at ease. They don't do the buying. The victim actually does the buying, and then they follow him up to a quiet turning. Edward then gets behind him and basically disables him by putting his hand over his mouth and holding him in a sort of like garroting neck hold, whilst William then robs him. Whether or not a knife was used in that attack, it's not mentioned. But when he's arrested for it, and these two guys disappear, they're at the same lodging house, and William goes one way and Edward goes another. But when they're arrested, Edward's reply is, "I did it for his own goodness." And this strange turn of talking and this ridiculous sort of a confidence that he seems to have. But that's his reply. And believe it or not, he gets away with this one as well. He actually gets away with it. So that's an example. But knives are not. There's no other evidence that I've seen with him having a knife in hand. But he could have been sort of tooled up, so to speak, for that robbery.
Because that's quite interesting. You say he gets away with it on. Because one of the things I did notice from your article in Crime Through Time was that there's almost, strange to say, there's almost a sympathy towards him as a victim from the magistrates. Francis almost gets completely brushed aside by the magistrates, that she's robbed him, so therefore she deserved what happened to her. I mean, that's an awful state of affairs. But do you think she was treated unfairly by the magistrates and authority?
Yeah, I think it's a very sad indictment of the times that they lived in. I think you're totally right. I've already mentioned the headline of that awful article, the East London Observer. It almost, it served her right. I think Lushington is the magistrate that seems to deal with him a lot, on quite a few occasions, and he's sympathetic. He's almost saying you're right, but you shouldn't have taken the law into your own hands. I talked about this, Edward, at a conference last week, and I was speaking to the writer Sarah Wise afterwards, and she was astonished by the amount of times that Edward had been released with very short sentences or a fine for his treatment of Francis. And it seems to be that, again, this regard for it to be some kind of domestic affair that needs to be dealt with or left to one side may be the reason he's been overlooked, because these are quite severe attacks, and he's got a real anger, and whatever is at the heart of that anger towards her could be key. But yes, I agree. He's had sort of sympathy all along, and it goes on through to the later stage of his life. He's almost treated often with like he's like a character, a humorous character rather than a dangerous man.
And he's almost like a caricature of a Victorian criminal when he appears in court. And of course, the other thing that becomes quite apparent, not just from him, but from a lot of the domestic violence cases and violence against women cases in the 19th century, is that it wasn't treated as seriously. One thing that astonished me is the lenient sentences that people used to get for assaulting women in the streets of London.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and then crimes which are finance related, and we'll see when we talk further about the end of Edward, got far tougher sentences than an assault on a woman, which is appalling.
But we have to put him now, so we have to get to 1888. So it's the year we have to look at. So let's start with Emma Elizabeth Smith. So she's attacked early April 1888. It's Easter Tuesday. She's walking past Whitechapel Church, and she notices a group of men coming towards her. Something about them startles her. She crosses over Whitechapel Road and goes down Osborne Street to avoid them. They follow her and they attack her. Do you think that could have been the Buckley brothers?
Um, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. In terms of were they capable of such an attack, I think most definitely. I also think we shouldn't dismiss that it might not necessarily be all three Buckley brothers. It could be a combination of Edward with any number of other stooges. He seems to attract these younger lieutenants. There's a George Hall that he commits a crime with as well. So providing all three were not incarcerated at the time, we know Edward was on the streets and around. I think it's entirely possible. It bears their signature. They dominated that road, and that connection he has to that 235 to 239 address. That's slightly further along from Osborne Street towards the kind of the hospital end, but that's his area. So I wouldn't dismiss it. I think if you picked anyone from the evidence we have, you could say these guys are possibles for it.
And of course, it's almost certain that whoever attacked Emma Smith wasn't Jack the Ripper, that it was a local gang, which did influence the early research into the early investigation into the Ripper, because they thought right up to Mary Nichols that the crimes were gang related. And then they start to come to the lone assassin idea. So Martha Tabram, who's the next victim, personally, I do believe she was a Jack the Ripper victim, the first victim. That's my personal belief. So do you think Edward could have, again, it's Edward's area because he's literally George Yard, Whitechapel High Street, just outside it, turn left, you're down on Whitechapel Road. So you're in his manor, as it were. Do you think that he could have attacked and murdered Martha Tabram?
Well, so if you and I had spoke about 1888 6 months ago, we would have had a blank canvas. We didn't know anything, but we've gradually, with the help of Jose Aranto, who's been fantastic, been able to piece together the first kind of 8 months of 1888 for Edward. He has a cycle of going into prison for violence and then coming out and then going in again. And with regards to Martha, he's arrested on the 30th of July. And he's put in prison just for three days. I think he's released on the Friday, I've got the date somewhere, Friday the 3rd or whatever of August. He comes out just in time for the bank holiday weekend, and Martha is attacked and killed on that bank holiday Monday. He's then only at liberty for another couple of weeks before he's in again. So that release date on that Friday of that bank holiday weekend, to me, is interesting because he's out, he's angry, and he's on the streets. And he would have been on the streets, and he would have been out there on bank holiday, no doubt.
So, and of course, you've got the crowds as well, because I mean that day was quite a wet day, so a lot of people went to the pubs and went to the People's Palace. I think Crystal Palace, Tower of London, all had record visitors on that particular bank holiday Monday. But of course, come the night, they're all piling into the pubs, and for a pickpocket, that's a perfect circumstance.
Yeah, and again, no doubt, a drunken pickpocket as well, because I think this guy's a heavy drinker. So if he earns money, that's where his money goes. And actually, we talk about Francis Jones being the love of his life. I think his first love is alcohol. Unfortunately, that's what his main driver is.
And when we come next, so we go to the next one now, which is Mary Nichols, August the 31st, who's generally thought to be the first Jack the Ripper victim. Do we know where he was then?
Well, again, he goes in for a short prison stint, and he's released, I think, on the 23rd or the 24th of August. When he's arrested for the August offence, I've looked at he's arrested by a PC Arthur Lang, and what I've done is just looked at where he was, just by cross-referencing in the papers, just to try and see where his beat was. And it's quite interesting that we can locate his beat in that kind of Hanbury Street area, which again puts Edward along that kind of zone, which relates to the murder victim. He's definitely, because I think it's Spittle Street or something like that. There's a couple of references to Arthur Lang, PC Arthur Lang patrolling there. So that could have very well changed by that period. But that sort of anecdotal evidence or circumstantial evidence of that. But he comes out again, and it's just in time for that attack on Polly Nichols. And you made that interesting point earlier. You said that up until the Nichols murder, a gang theory was put forward. I don't necessarily believe that if you have a gang theory and Edward is part of this, that it has to be a gang that carries out every attack. I think Edward is an individual who's capable of attacking a woman on his own, as well as with a collaborator or a lookout, or whilst he's with someone else. I think he's able to inflict fear and some kind of charismatic control over his compatriots. But I think, I would bear in mind the fact that up until Nichols, that it was regarded that these killings were could have been a gang. It's only the leather apron issue that suddenly throws that away, and we then go into a different direction.
And you mentioned collaborators or accomplices or lookouts. Of course, the famous one here is Elizabeth Stride, when Israel Schwarz is walking down Berners Street, 12:45. So this is 15 minutes before her body's found in Dutfield's yard. And Israel Schwarz sees her being attacked in the gateway where the body's later found 15 minutes later. And he thinks it's a domestic argument, so crosses the road to avoid it. And there's another man opposite who someone calls Lipsky out, and the other man appears to follow him. So do you think that attack, he could have, again, could he have seen Edward Buckley attacking Elizabeth Stride?
In terms of this idea that there could have been more than one person involved, that Stride murder is possibly the best example we have, because there could be some kind of interaction between the man lighting the pipe on one side of the road and the perpetrator that's pulling the woman either out or into the yard that's seen. The fact that Lipsky is called out suggests to me that you cannot be a Jew. If you were a Jew, you wouldn't call another person by a Jewish insult. So it suggests that they're non-Jews, in my humble opinion. So it could be that is exactly what's going on in that circumstance. There is some kind of a intimidating attack going on. Interestingly, there is a connection, obviously, with Elizabeth Stride to Devonshire Street, as well as Frances Jones to Devonshire Street. But both the women, both Elizabeth and Frances, were, for a time, Elizabeth Stride was getting help down at Swedenborg Square, I think, in 1884, after John Stride died. And likewise, after that November attack by Edward Buckley with the fork, we know that Frances had actually entered the Bridge of Hope building in the Princes Street, which was one of the first to be opened by Mary Steer. So she wasn't that far away from Stride, a matter of a few doors. Both getting assistance. They was trying to sort of, I suppose, like an attempt at rehabilitation for Frances. It didn't work because she went back out and she went to Devonshire Street. But it does throw up to me an interesting, possibly that they might have known each other or been acquainted with each other, especially that the street connection they have. So whether or not Buckley was aware of Stride or she knew him by sight, I'm not sure, but it's a possible.
And then we come to Katherine Eddowes. So he goes, or the murderer goes from Dutfield's yard towards the City of London. Of course, that's if you believe that the two murders were committed by the same person, because there is a body of thought that suggests that Elizabeth Stride wasn't a Jack the Ripper victim, that it was a domestic argument that was taking place, and that she was murdered as a result of that, which is why she didn't suffer the horrific mutilations that the other victims suffered. Personally, I think it's because Deemschutz coming into the yard disturbed the killer. But I say that body of thought there, that Stride isn't related to the other killings, and it's only because it took place in the area at the time that her name appears on the list of the so-called canonical five, which I hate that term, but the canonical five but the canonical five victims. So, what would link him to Katherine Eddowes' murder?
Well, there's this. I don't know. Obviously, you've read the article. The knife attack that's carried out on Frances in 5 Devonshire Street. The knife is dragged across the bridge of her nose to her cheek. An artist has reconstructed that picture for us based just on the medical evidence we have. The artist has got no history with the Ripper or doesn't really know the story, so she recreated the picture, and it's quite astonishing. If you look at the picture of that knife wound on her face, it mirrors in life the wound to Eddowes facing death, that knife cut across the face. I do think that to me that was a sort of a deep breath moment when I looked at it, and I thought there are some similarities. The only thing is, obviously, it's two opposites. They occurred on the opposite side of the face, but the wounds are very, very similar. Obviously, the one carried out on Eddowes was after she'd been killed. But if you're looking at someone that's developing a technique and prepared to, he's done that on someone he's supposedly close to. That is quite a horrific attack, and it is a very similar wound.
And then moving on from that, we then come to that month. Do we know? You say during October. Because, of course, there were no murders in October. So the whole of October passes by without any murder taking place. And then he returns in November. And you think that he might have been away because of the race meetings. That's why there were no murders in October.
I think in terms of future research, and for anyone who's interested in this, that's where the research should focus. I think there were a number of busy race meetings that particular month. I've only just come to learn by reading the One Armed Jack book that Croydon races was quite a busy race festival. We've got a record for Edward Buckley that matches our Edward. His language is very similar. For 1890, on the Newmarket Road, being in a lodging house and assaulting someone. So it suggests that he's definitely at some point in the future, he carries on his kind of lifestyle of going up to these festivals, and then maybe makes his way back to London. I can't pinpoint a particular race festival. I know that, as I say, in October Newmarket was quite busy, and you would have had races at Epsom and the main race places. They seem to have occurred far more frequently than they do today. So that's just one thought of a reason that it could have been quite in that particular month. There could be any number of reasons, of course.
Do we know he's back in Whitechapel? Do we know he's in Whitechapel in early November when Mary Kelly's murdered?
No, I would love to say that we do. We've got Edward does not really appear to us again until very early in April 1889. So we have got a complete blank. We've looked through the records. Jose Aranto has looked through all the records. We can't find any arrest reports and any evidence of him being active at that time. So it's very quiet. But that's not to say they might turn up in the future, because they could turn up in the future, and we could even eliminate him in the future. We could find him being arrested somewhere else or in a completely different location. But he's not incarcerated either at that time.
Okay. And it strikes me he's an alcoholic. He's drink is a major problem with him, and he seems to be one of those people who, when he has a drink, it brings out sort of an inner rage. There's an awful rage. So he's drunk and he's got this rage. Would that be the sort of person who do you think the victims would go easily with, without any trepidation?
I think this is a tough question, because it also it means that you have to look at the spectrum of victims that we've got in this case. There is an interesting story with Frances Coles, the Eleanor Kalana story, where a man approaches Eleanor and says, "Will you go with me?" And she's clearly not happy, and then he punches and strikes her. That's very Edward-like behaviour. He instantly punches out, and then he goes off with Frances Coles. But of course, the debate would be, is Frances Coles a Ripper victim or not? But I mentioned earlier this Irish Cockney charm or charisma that he must have. He demonstrates definite control over people around him, and that can't just be fear. That must be something else. So some of the incidents we've already talked about, when he's in Whitechapel Road, his brother is fighting tooth and nail to release him. He's also involved in another fight 3 months later in July with police, and the young man with him, George Hall, gets a longer sentence for trying to pull away and release Edward. So there's something that he's got. I can't put my fingers on it. So in answer to your question, is he able to charm? Is he able to turn on this Irish Cockney charm to encourage them, to make them put people at ease? Possibly, but that streak of violence is there. But Frances came back. She's come back over a number of occasions. So there must be another element to this guy's personality that we cannot potentially put our finger on.
And so we have him through the murders. That's the then he goes into the 1890s, and of course, as is so often the case, it happened with the victims. It's happened with so many criminals as well who are alcoholics. The alcohol began to take its toll on him, and he starts to become, well, not just physically ill but mentally ill from the alcohol abuse, or the addiction abuse of the 1890s. And he does get involved. Is it in 1896? He gets involved is involved in a very bizarre occurrence. Well, I'll let you tell people what that occurrence was.
Yeah, again, this is a story that you would actually laugh at this story without being aware of this man's history. But 1896, an off-duty city policeman is on a bus or a tram, making his way back towards the city, and he looks down from where he's sitting, and he sees a man on the Whitechapel Road slowly stripping, taking every item of clothes off. So he's standing there naked with his clothes piled on the floor. So the policeman alights the bus and does his duty and arrests him. The magistrate is appalled. This behaviour is not acceptable. Edward says nothing. He's just stripped himself off. He has no qualms about it. And this is the beginning of almost like a comic incidents in his life that distract from the violence that he's carried out. But that one is actually illustrated in the police news, and you can see a picture of this man stripping. And if you look closely as well, I've been speaking recently to a gentleman who's a bit of an expert on Irish history, and particularly the Irish diaspora in London, and he says the facial illustration, most Victorian readers would have known straight away that was an Irishman, an Irish Londoner, rather than an Englishman. The pipe, the hat, and the sort of goatee beard, and he's standing there with his clothes in his arm. So yeah, that's an indication of the decline that was hitting Edward through alcohol.
It's almost a comic illustration, isn't it? It could almost be a character. But we've got him. And we've also got this photograph of him, which I believe is 1900.
I think 1903.
1903. So it's the early 1900s. Do we know what crime that was taken for?
I think it's an arrest for one of his petty crimes that he's carried out. And then he's placed on the habitual drunken register for the police to be aware of. So it's a photographic record for them to refer to. And it shows that he has been very much aged by drink. We know it's definitely Edward, but he's been aged by 10 years on the record. But there's later records that we've got that connect him to all of the instances and shows his actual age. So this is the grey-haired man that you see in the photos that we have. And it says that he basically haunts the streets of Whitechapel, the Whitechapel lodging houses, which we know, and Hoxton as well. So he wanders around drinking between lodging houses and between assaulting policemen, basically, and carrying out crime.
And of course, one argument that a lot of people will raise, which is brought forward in so many suspects, is that he carries on so long after the murders of 1888. I mean, he lives I've forgotten what he lives to now. He lives to
February 1924.
So he lives for a long time afterwards. So how would you tackle that argument that he wouldn't have stopped killing?
This is a controversial one because I've worked closely on this project with Jurriaan, who has his own take on things, and he's not suspect driven. I think I would not dismiss that he carried out other attacks. I would look at some of the instances that occurred around the Whites Row lodging houses in 1900, 1901. I think there were some incidents there, but that's going off track slightly. But in terms of his decline, I think you can see a marked decline from him from the early 1890s. It would be marvellous, great for me to turn around and say to you, after November 1888, he wasn't the same man. I don't think there's any particular evidence of that. He's still operating and carrying out crimes in 1894, which shows he's got ability. But I think this alcohol his driver has taken him over. He's that takes hold of him, and I think it weakens his ability, it weakens his senses, and I think that is the prime mover. There is a kind of an interesting aside that you won't be aware of, but it's a kind of stop press moment from me that researcher Susie Huntington has started to look at this, so as interest is gathering, and she's discovered that there is evidence that a child was born to Edward sometime around 1889 to 1890. Now, Francis had never successfully carried a child, and I think that may have been the heart of his inner turmoil or his inner violence. And now we've found evidence that there was a child that's that's on the census in 1921 with Francis's name. He's called Walter Francis Jones. And we can't quite pin down, but he's born somewhere between 1889 and 1890. Now, if a successful child is born, is that a reason for him to then change his ways? I mean, change his ways. He never stopped being violent towards policemen and drinking, but does he change towards Francis, whose fate we still don't know, because this child is not brought up with Francis. It's brought up with his family, as far as we know. But that's an added element that's literally 24 hours old, and that's why this story is still growing.
So, and it is. It's. I mean, your research is ever evolving. I mean, it's been something that you've taken on, and it's grown. You've found different things out. You've edged it a bit further forward, and then, as with so many, such a frustrating case, because you take 2 steps forward, and then you're forced into 3 steps backwards to actually get before, and then suddenly you'll have a rush forward, and then it'll fall back again. So, what became of him? After, so we've got him up until that picture in 1903. So what happened to him between then and his death?
So he basically his life gradually deteriorates into these short-term stints for alcoholism and drink. He goes in and out of the asylum. His first asylum visit is as early as 1894, 1895, possibly at Banstead, and we've got some records for that. He's in and out of Leavesden in the mid 1900s, and he's often released to his sister Mary Ann to Hackney, to Brunswick Street, or his brother, who's now moved to Clapham. So that's what happens to him. We've got an incident in 1907, which again demonstrates what he's like as an individual. He's seen running down Aldgate High Street towards Whitechapel, shouting, "I've just blown up London Bridge, and I'm going to stagger humanity." So he's arrested for that one. And again, and the court, and there's laughter in the court. He's treated as if he's some kind of freak, I suppose, is one of the words that's quoted in the press. But he's asked, he says, they say to him, "Why did you do this?" And he goes, "I'm a certified lunatic. That's all I've got to say." And the court falls into laughter. So he's got this eccentric behaviour, but he seems to love to draw attention to himself. So that's 1907. And then 1909, he's observed by a tram inspector called, I think, Charles Grover on the Whitechapel Road, and he's mingling with passengers, getting on and off one of the trams, and he knocks this gentleman's hat off. And as the gentleman bends over, he lifts the wallet out of his pocket. The gentleman's never traced, but at court, the judge says, "We know that you've been incarcerated more or less continually since 1885. I think Edward tries to play the lunacy card, that, I've been in a lunatic asylum, you need to treat me with leniency." But for this one, he gets 21 months, which we were talking earlier about the differences between, he got 4 weeks for beating poor Francis in a pub. He got 4 weeks. He gets 21 months for stealing a wallet of a man they cannot trace. And that shows the difference. So that's kind of, when he's captured for this particular crime, I think it sums up what's happened to him, because this man would have fought and would have gone for the inspector or the police. He says, "It's okay, you don't have to worry," meaning, "I'm not going to do anything, I'll go quietly." And I think that kind of sums up his real decline. And thereafter, for that last 10 years, he seems to haunt all the places associated with the Ripper victims. That's more likely to do with the fact that they are the downtrodden, the lowest areas. But he's in the renamed Dorset Street, he's in Duval Street, he's in Thrall Street lodging houses, he's in is in White's Row, is in Commercial Street, or in the Victoria Working Man's Club. He's just haunting these establishments. And then in 1923, of all ironies, he's found kind of drunk and collapsed in the very place that he was living when he attacked Francis Jones, Hanbury Street, and the kind of the street that does link him for me to the Ripper murders, Hanbury Street. So that's where he's last found, and he passes away in Hoxton, in a Hoxton workhouse in the January, and he's listed as a journeyman cigar maker on his death certificate, and his address. They use the address of his sister, and his niece is the one that kind of signs the certificate.
One thing that what you said there, which I found quite interesting, was that the fact he's doing the pickpocketing when he's an alcoholic, so he must have still had a very steady hand to be able to do the pickpocketing and not be noticed still.
I think so. And what we're seeing crimes that he's captured for. So what about the ones that he's not captured for? And I think there's a lot of evidence in that early part of his career up to the sort of up till 1888 that I think what happens is he has a big hit. Some of them, the quantities of money involved, particularly with the one at Kempton races with Alfred Benn, you're looking at in excess of £60 of money, which would have been a lot of money then, and the attack on and the James Arnold affair in 1884. I think what he would do is that he would use money to then short-term rent a property. He's got money to splash, and then he probably drinks it away, and then has to move on. So he's this guy that he's continually moving around the area. He uses Dempsey Street as an address a lot, but there's no evidence whatsoever that he ever lived in Dempsey Street. This guy's kind of hidden amongst the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, and he's staying in various lodging houses, I believe.
So, of course, the big question, the most important question of all. Do you think he 100% was Jack the Ripper?
Okay, in this again, this is I knew this question might come, and this is the hardest question for anyone. I don't think in our subject there is any. We cannot have any 100% until something turns up. There's no 100% in this subject. And if my colleague, who I deeply respect, was here, Jurriaan, he would be loath to even say that he should be a suspect. He would call him a person of interest only, and what he would be stressing is the story of Edward himself from birth to death is the interesting aspect here, and I do agree with a lot of that. So I cannot say 100% in terms of all the people that I've read and the suspects that I'm aware of are out there. I do believe this man is the best I've seen. And I think the key to that is I think we must, in some instances, try to remove the blinkers or the for the last 100 years or so, we've got this growth in this serial killer profiling, and it's become very dominant. If you strip that away and look at what this chap has done with a knife to a woman and the locations, he's a good suspect. But because we are obsessed with believing a serial killer has certain prerequisites, he works alone, then we look at his childhood, etc., we might be blinkered to seeing the true reality of what happened in 1888. Was that the abhorrent violence that was born and created through the poverty of that area expressing themselves in an attack on those women, rather than some kind of we almost ascribe mystical qualities to this killer that come out that wasn't from the area. These killings were born and bred in Whitechapel. They were born and bred in those alleyways, those rookeries, those lodging houses. That's where they came from. So I cannot say 100%, but I do feel this guy is a strong guy as a suspect.
And your research into him is evolving. It's evolving research. It's ongoing research. I first heard about him when I read your excellent article in Crime Through Time, and I'll put a link to the magazine down below so that people can, if they want to subscribe and get the article, they can. But obviously, you're continuing the research. So how can people follow your research and find out more?
Well, we've got the Jurriaan led the writing on the forums article that we've done, and it's extremely detailed. It's every part of our research. So anything that I've spoke to you about today, we can back up with evidence, and that's one of your go-to places. Look at the JTR forum site, and there's discussion threads with this find that we've only just made regards to a possible child for Edward. That's on there. So look at those. I will continue to. I've always enjoyed creating small stories and then putting them out on the main Jack the Ripper sites that have the largest followers, and I'll continue to do that. And if you want to make a comment, do so. And I would encourage you definitely to read Adam's magazine, because the idea of that particular magazine is exactly the Jack the Ripper in himself. It enables us to throw a torchlight upon a fascinating period of history, and this is a great opportunity to read about it. And Edward's story is one of those stories that we can now find that we never would have been aware of had it not been for Jack the Ripper, ironically. So that's another area to look at.
I'll put a link to the forums research in the description down below, so people can go to that. As I say, I'll put a link to Adam's Crime Through Time, a new magazine, incidentally, a new crime magazine, which is wonderful quality. And of course, yours is one of the very first articles in that magazine.
Yeah, proud to be part of it.
Yeah, and it's an excellent article. So, well, Jonathan, can I just say, it's been a fascinating discussion. It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your new suspect with us, and all the very best.
And to you, I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening as well.